All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is adolescence, adolescent physiologic development. So somewhere between elementary and adolescence, kids hit that pre-puberty growth spurt, and then they move into puberty. That varies quite a bit from one kid to another. On average, girls are a couple years ahead of boys in terms of puberty development. So you can look at the Tanner stages. I'm not testing over them, but I want you to have an idea of what is meant when someone says Tanner stage 2. What is that? What I want you to have some context for that. Not that you need to know all the criteria for it, but what the Tanner stages is a set of criteria to stage pubertal development. So it begins with 0 development at all, still physiologically looks very much like a child, and then moves to beginning to develop some secondary sex characteristics and on until full sexual maturation. And those stages are based on specific criteria. So they give you an idea where that child is in the process of physical sexual maturation. Now, before that physical sexual development, there's a growth spurt. Typically, most kids start growing a year or so before they get to puberty. They start growing, they start developing some secondary sex characteristics like breast, hips, facial hair, things like that. And again, that happens earlier for girls than for boys. So if you go into a middle school, all the girls are here and all the boys are here because they've hit that growth spurt, and the boys still very much look like little boys on average. So also during puberty, growth continues to be rapid. About 2 years after menarche, girls typically stop growing. Boys tend to grow longer because they start puberty later. They tend to grow longer, and they may not reach their complete height growth until late teens to early 20s. So just so that you're aware of that. Psychosocial for teenagers. I love teenagers. They're my absolute favorite. It is not an easy time of life. Their entire job psychologically is to figure out who they are. According to Erickson's psychosocial theory, this is the conflict between identity and role diffusion. Who am I? Am I a person with my own thoughts, feelings, etc.? So it's important for them to develop their own individual identity for kids to separate from parents. That's really hard on both sides. It's very hard on parents. It's very hard on the kids. Sometimes they are pushing parents away in an attempt to do that. There's a stage in that development of an individual identity called group identity. So early in adolescence, think junior high, kids need to separate from their parents, but it's really, really scary to do that and just be all on your own. And so they tend to develop a group identity. They become part of a group, or they try to find a group they fit into. And then they're all like clones of each other. They have a uniform, they use the same language. If you go to a middle school playground at lunchtime, you will see different groups, and you'll see that within the group, they all are dressed the same. They're all just very, they do the same things. And those groups may be formed on common interest. It may be based on proximity. This is just who lives near me. But the group tends to cling together, and their identity is as part of that group. It's really important that that group is separate and different from the adults. You'll also see early adolescents trying on different identities. They may go from wearing pastels and preppy clothes to all black to, who knows? So to jeans and band t-shirts. They're trying to figure out who they are. They're trying to find a group they fit into. Now, that happens in early adolescence, and later in adolescence, they can become an individual. Even if they maintain that same friend group, they can become an individual within that group. And so they develop more of an individual, independent identity. There's a lot of push for independence. Adolescents are close to adulthood. They're so close they can smell it, and they want it. They want to be independent and make their own decisions and think for themselves. And that can be a source of conflict for families. Family is still the primary influence, but peer influence is also a huge part of their lives. This is also when kids start to question the beliefs and values they have been taught. And that is really hard for parents frequently, but they really have to question those things to figure out if that's what they believe for themselves or not. Anticipatory guidance, nutrition. Adolescents are always hungry. Most of them are always hungry. They eat nonstop. They eat 6 meals a day and get up in the middle of the night and make brownies or pork chops or they're always hungry because they're growing. If they're athletes, they're growing and they're using up a lot of energy. So that's even more. So they're always eating, but they don't always eat the healthiest food. They're busy. They've got lots of things going on. And so they may not make the healthiest choices in regard to diet. So we can encourage these kids. Now we're interacting with the kid with this anticipatory guidance. We're teaching them how to eat more healthfully for their long-term health and for their health and how they feel now. Adolescents tend to be present focused. So if you say to them, well, if you live on pizza and Chick-fil-A, you are going to have high cholesterol and have to take meds when you're 40. 40 is not real to a teenager. Okay. 40 is not really real to 20 somethings. It's just not a real number to them. And so you probably are going to have better success with focusing on how eating healthfully, staying hydrated, getting plenty of nutrients is going to help their athletic performance or help that whatever there is going on, it's going to help them feel better. It will help them have more energy. Those are the kind of things that are going to be more effective. Sleep. Most adolescents don't get enough sleep. They have homework. They have jobs. They have cars and go hang out. They have social media. They have sports. They have other activities. They have family responsibilities. And then they want a social life. So most adolescents don't get enough sleep. That does affect their development and their mood and their physical health. Okay, social media is part of our world, and we can either try to reject it or we can accept it and try to teach kids how to use it in healthier ways, because social media is not going away. It can be a way for kids to stay connected when their lives are busy. It's been a way for kids to stay connected during the pandemic. It's really replaced some of the ways that we socialized in my generation, but not completely. You know, my kids still go sit up in Peak's parking lot, even though they also have social media, but it has pros and cons. It can also be a mechanism for bullying. It can be consuming. Kids see someone else's life as they present it on social media, and they don't see the ugly parts, and they compare themselves to that. So that can be really difficult. There's been a lot of bullying. There are risks of being trafficked by being groomed on social media. And it interferes with sleep a lot because there's an expectation, because constant communication is possible. There is an expectation socially that we are available because it's technologically possible. That is heightened for adolescents when their social development and interaction with peers is so critical. So leaving something on red, or leaving someone on red or on open can be perceived as an insult or as uncaring, because, you know, if you care about me, you're going to respond right away. So kids sleep with their phones, they answer their phones all night long, so they really can interfere with sleep. We can encourage parents to have reasonable guidelines about those. Kids are really good at getting around those guidelines. So we also need to be helping kids recognize some of the dangers of that and maybe learning how to draw some boundaries around their lives a little bit. Sex education, there is always controversy about how much adolescents should be taught. But research is relatively clear that kids who know more tend to wait longer. Kids who've had comprehensive sex education, which includes the risk of sexual activity, contraception, protection against illness, as well as consent and boundaries and things like that, those kids tend to actually wait longer to initiate sex than kids who have had no sex education or it's been focused on abstinence. So we know that comprehensive sex ed tends to be more effective. Kids need clear, accurate information, and they need healthcare professionals who will answer their questions and avoid judgment and avoid being shocked by them. Because if they're saying something with the intention of shock, when we act shocked, we've reinforced that. If they're saying something genuinely, if we act shocked, they can shut down. So you got to really perfect your poker face. You need to know that adolescents legally can, in almost every state, can obtain contraception, care for pregnancy, STI testing and treatment, and drug treatment without parental consent, and that in fact we cannot divulge that to their parents without their permission. We want to encourage them to involve caring adults in their decision making. So ideally, if their parents are caring adults, we want to encourage that. But we know that some children actually are at risk for abuse when that type of care is involved, which is the reason for those laws. Safety, can I say MVC enough times? Kids are learning to drive, they're distracted drivers, they're not great at applying consequences to themselves in real time. They know that if you drive too fast, you can have a wreck, and they know if you drink and drive, you can have a wreck, but they have a really hard time applying that to themselves. They don't necessarily think that will happen to them. So lots and lots and lots of education and limit setting on young inexperienced drivers. I also encourage teens, encourage parents to do this as well, but I encourage teens to have someone that you can call, have a safe adult you can call for a ride if you get in a situation where your only transportation is going to involve impaired driving, whether they're impaired themselves or their ride is impaired. They need to have a safe adult. Okay, so next is firearms. And I know that we live in hunting country, but kids and firearms can increase the risks. So there's a couple of things. Kids who are using guns need to be educated really carefully about gun safety. They need to have really pretty strict rules about gun safety, about getting guns out when there are other kids around. But also they need to be evaluated, and parents need to be really honest with themselves about whether their kids have the maturity to hunt and use guns independently, and about their mental health. Because the presence of a gun, a child who has suicidal ideation, the presence of a gun drastically increases the risk that they'll successfully die by suicide. And sometimes frequently that suicidal ideation is a temporary state. It's an impulse. And if there's not a means there, or if the means is more difficult, that gives the child more time to get some help and try to work through what's going on. So the presence of firearms is a risk. That's not to say don't have guns. That's to say that parents need to really be responsible in teaching their kids, but also evaluating their kids' maturity and mental health. Sports, kids get bigger, sports get riskier. Sports injuries become more severe in high school because the children are bigger. Another thing that begins to show up in adolescence is those repetitive motion injuries. Kids that have been doing the same sport since they were 10 years old or younger, 6 years old, in middle school and high school, they may begin to have some chronic damage that leads to repetitive motion type injuries. So again, proper safety equipment, proper training, proper coaching, and taking the risk seriously. Relationship violence is another thing that we really need to bring up with adolescent safety. We tend to think of domestic violence as married people who are in a violent relationship, but that behavior, abusive behavior, does not start in adulthood or in marriage. It starts younger. That dynamic starts in adolescent relationships. And so we need to be teaching kids about healthy relationships, about boundaries and control, and respecting the boundaries of other people. And that can help protect them from abuse, but can also help them avoid becoming abusers. Okay, that's all the developmental stuff. It was really quick. The next section, we're going to talk about how to adjust nursing care for children.